In this position, a young Emmanuel Lasker, just 30 years old and not yet world champion, is about to show the world an attacking pattern to destroy the castled king for the very first time. He has chosen the bird opening, 1f4, clearing the way for both bishops to keep open diagonals aimed straight at the black king. Then he plays knight to h5. Do you know with what intention? If not, stay tuned. We are about to find out. This move not only aims to double black's pawns, but, more importantly, to further clear those diagonals. Therefore, after the exchange on h5, Lasker does not recapture the knight right away. Instead, he begins a spectacular thematic combination with bishop takes h7. The king is forced to capture. Now white takes the knight with check. The king steps back to g8, and immediately comes the second thunderbolt. Bishop takes g7. Declining the capture will not save black from total destruction. So after king takes g7, the monarch is completely exposed, and it only takes one more piece to finish the job. But not rook to f3 right away, because black could move the rook and escape via f8. Instead, queen to g4, a strong move, forces the king over to the h-file, leaving it trapped. Now here it is, rook to f3, and there is no way to stop the deadly threat. As we can see from this example, knowing patterns to destroy the castled king is essential if we want to win more games. That is why, in this lesson, we will explore 5 powerful attacking patterns, and then you will put them into practice by solving 15 exercises designed to progressively sharpen your tactical vision and help you recognize them in your own games. So let's begin with the first 3 exercises. In this first exercise, we have Aaron Nimzovich with the white pieces and Siegbert Tarasch with black, 2 very strong players from the early 20th century. If we look closely at the position, we can see that both bishops are aiming at the king's side, but one of them is still trapped. It's black to move. Pause the video and try to play like Dr. Tarasch did. In this position, black continued with d4, a strong move. Mr. Nimzovich decided to capture the pawn, but instead of recapturing, black launched the double bishop sacrifice, the centerpiece of this lesson, starting with bishop takes h2. The king takes, and now the queen gains a tempo with queen h4 check. The king retreats to g1, and of course, Tarasch follows up with the second bishop sacrifice, which completely tears apart white's castled position. We already know that if the bishop is captured, white would be met with queen g4 check, forcing the king onto the h-file, after which comes the thematic rook d5, and there is no satisfactory answer to the threat of rook to h5. For this reason, Nimzovich declined to take the second bishop and instead played f3. But after rook to e8, the attack remained deadly, now threatening to invade via e2. White replied with knight e4, and the queen gave check on h1. The king fled to f2, and black proceeded to capture the rook on f1 with the bishop. In fact, black ended up winning material, since the bishop could not be taken. Otherwise, queen h2 check would follow, winning the white queen on c2. Just a few moves later, Nimzovich had no choice but to resign. Let's move on to the next position. We are playing with the white pieces. Once again, we see both bishops aiming at the castled king. But the question is it already time to sacrifice, or is there something we need to do first? Pause the video, analyze the position, and make the right decision. In this position, the most accurate move is knight b6, a strong move. The goal is to either deflect or eliminate this piece, so it cannot come to the king's defense. After the knight is captured on b6, white does not waste a tempo recapturing. Instead, they are already prepared to launch the double bishop sacrifice, starting with bishop takes h7. After the king captures, white follows up with the typical queen h5, gaining a tempo. The king retreats to g8, and immediately comes the second bishop sacrifice on g7. If black refuses to take the bishop and plays something like f6, then queen g6 is simply devastating. And if black does capture the bishop, well, by now, we already know the winning mechanism. First comes a check on g4. The king cannot go to f6 because that would lead to immediate mate with queen g5, so it is forced to move over to the h file. After that, white plays the decisive move, rook f3, and there is no way to stop the deadly threat. That's why black resigned. It's worth noting that if we hadn't first deflected the knight on d5, if it were still on the board in this position, black could give back some material with knight takes f4, stopping the rook h3 idea. That's exactly why the initial move knight b6 was the most precise. Let's move on to exercise number 3, and here's the question. How would you continue playing with the black pieces? If you spot an interesting idea, take your time and calculate it. At the end of the video, we'll see if you got it right. In this position, English Grandmaster Tony Miles, playing black, continued with pawn takes pawn, opening up both diagonals for his bishops. For example, if white captures with the bishop, the game is won just as we've learned before, starting with bishop takes h2 check. After the king captures comes queen h4, and king g1 is the only move. Now comes the next thunderbolt, bishop takes g2. If white tries f3, the attack continues with rook f6. And if they decide to capture the bishop, just like we saw earlier, the first move is a check, this time on g5. The king is forced onto the h file, and now comes the thematic rook f6, with the idea of bringing the rook to h6 for checkmate. With these 3 examples and the introductory position, I think we've fully grasped this attacking theme. Now, let's move on to the next concept, where we'll study another powerful attacking idea. Chances are that something like this has already happened in one of your games, whether you are the attacker or the defender. For example, black plays h6, and naturally, we wonder, is it possible to sacrifice a piece here to tear apart the castling and maybe grab a couple of pawns too? Well, to know whether this sacrifice is sound or not, we first need to understand one key concept. Can we quickly bring more pieces into the attack? Let's take a look. After capturing the pawn and the pieces taken, the queen enters menacingly on h6. The bishop is also aiming at h7, the knight can jump to g5, and a rook can move to the 3rd rank to join the attack. That makes 4 pieces ready to strike the king, and if we look at black's pieces, we'll notice they're far away from the defense. Sometimes it's very hard to calculate everything precisely, but this concept is something we need to understand deeply in order to evaluate whether the attack has high chances of success or is likely to fail. We'll explore it in much greater detail in the Attack Concepts course, but for now, I'll just introduce it briefly. Black tried to bring pieces back quickly to defend with queen f4, but white responded with bishop h7 check, and the only move for the king was to retreat to the corner. And of course, exchanging queens is out of the question, so the knight goes to g5 to prevent it. The white attack is unstoppable. There's no surviving with 3 pieces hovering over the king. Black tried to defend with knight f8, but now comes bishop g6, a discovered check. The king moves to g8, and after that, bishop takes f7, check. This forces the queen to capture, the knight recaptures, and then the king takes back. 3 pieces have been exchanged for the queen, but white has also captured all 3 pawns that were protecting the enemy king. And reinforcements are still coming, with rook d3 on the way. Black is completely lost. Now we'll move on to the 3 practical exercises. Your task will be to evaluate whether, after the sacrifice, you have enough resources to make the attack work, and whether the piece sacrifice is fully justified or not. In this first position, black has just played e5, attacking the bishop. White to move and win. Pause the video and try to find the winning continuation. In this position, it's true that black's pieces are closer to the defense of their king. But even so, white already has a rook positioned on the 3rd rank. We also see the dangerous bishop aiming at the king's side, the knights are ready for direct battle, and the queen can quickly join the attack as well. That's why the sacrifice has a high chance of success. After the piece is captured, the rook immediately joins the attack, delivering check. There's no choice but to move the king to h8, and now the white queen makes a subtle move to d2, threatening the weak pawn on h6. To defend it, the only move is knight g8, but the sacrifices continue. This time the rook is given up. The idea is that after the king takes, the queen captures dangerously on h6. There's a threat to move the knight and enter decisively on h7, so black plays rook e8, but that doesn't stop anything, and white continues with knight d6. The threat to invade h7 remains, along with several others. Black is completely lost. The engine evaluates the position as +4 in white's favor. You'll find this position in the exercise section, so you can analyze it more deeply with the engine if needed. For now, let's move on to exercise 2. This next position is taken from the Caro-Kann defense course, which will be available a bit later. Black to move and win. How would you continue the attack? Once again, we see familiar elements at play. After bishop takes h3, the exchanges follow. The queen now stands very menacingly on this square. Once again, we see the important bishop targeting the critical h2 square. The knight can quickly join the attack, and so can a rook. So this sacrifice is fully justified and has every chance of succeeding. White tried to defend with bishop f4. But black doesn't take, allowing the queen to recapture and join the defense. Instead, they continue with the strong move rook e4, bringing yet another piece into the attack. After bishop takes d6, the rook recaptures, and now that the bishop is gone, rook g4 mate becomes a direct threat. So, to avoid this, the knight retreats to h2. The rook then moves to h4, attacking the knight, which cannot be defended. The bishop moves to f3, hoping that if the second player captures on h2, the king can escape via f1 and e2. But black plays it brilliantly. Instead of taking on h2, they push f5, preparing to bring the other rook decisively into the attack. Now white has no way to stop the checkmate. This next exercise may look very simple, but in reality, it requires great precision, especially on move number 2. White to move and win. Pause the video and try to find the winning continuation. Once again, we see all the key elements that suggest this attack can truly work. We see the important bishop attacking along this diagonal, and a knight already close to the king, while the other can also jump in quickly. Once again, the rook is ready to join the attack along the e-file. That's why bishop takes h6 is a truly strong move. Now the problem is that after queen takes h6 in this case, black can immediately reply with bishop f8, driving the queen away from her critical position and bringing more pieces to the defense. That's why, as we mentioned earlier, precision is essential. Before capturing on h6, we must continue dismantling black's king position with the brilliant move knight takes f7, double exclamations for this one. The idea is that after the knight is captured, now queen takes on h6, and the difference from the previous line is that bishop f8 no longer works because it would be checkmate immediately on g6. As a result, the king is left completely exposed with no pawn shelter, at the mercy of an attack by the queen, bishop, knight, and rook with no way to survive. The engine shows mate in 8 moves. I hope this has helped clarify when this thematic sacrifice against castling, which appears in many games, can be truly devastating, and when it's simply an ineffective trade, a piece for 2 pawns. Now, let me invite you to move on to the next lesson, where we'll explore another classic sacrifice against the castled king. In chess, the so-called Greek gift is inspired by the famous Trojan horse from Greek mythology. It is a recurring attacking pattern against the castled king, seen in countless games throughout chess history. The first known use dates back to 1620, played by the Italian Gioacchino Greco, and even today, it continues to claim victims at all levels of play. The idea is to sacrifice the bishop on h7, and after the king captures, the knight jumps to g5 with check. If the black king steps up to g6, in many cases the attack continues with queen d3, or more commonly, queen g4. And if instead of this continuation, the king retreats to g8, then the attack continues mercilessly with queen h5. There's a direct threat of checkmate on h7, and the only way to stop it is by bringing the rook over to e8. Now comes a checkmate in 5 moves that every player should know. It starts with queen takes f7, check. The black king is forced to move to h8. Then comes queen h5, check again, and the king must return to g8. Now we continue with queen h7, check. The only legal move is king f8, followed by queen h8, check. King goes to e7, and finally, queen takes on g7, checkmate. Make sure to remember this 5-move checkmating sequence. It's a classic and shows up quite often. Of course, this sacrifice is not always executed in exactly the same way. There are many variations. So, here are a few tips to help you recognize when this attack is likely to succeed. First, after the bishop sacrifice and the king captures, the knight must be able to jump to g5. Without the power of this knight, the attack will rarely work. In many cases, there's a bishop guarding that g5 square. When that happens, you either need to deflect the bishop or play h4 first, so that if the bishop captures, you can recapture with the pawn and bring the rook into the attack. We will look at an example of this later. Second, for this attack to succeed, it is crucial that black cannot defend the h7 square. Many times the sacrifice turns out to be premature because black can bring a knight to f6 or f8 and defend this square. Or sometimes, and this is very common, a queen or a bishop can reach this diagonal and manage to defend just in time. Third tip, if the king moves to g6 instead of g8, as we mentioned earlier, the key moves are queen g4 or queen d3. In these positions, calculating everything to the very end can be incredibly tricky, so the smartest approach is to evaluate the overall position and ask yourself, can black really survive with the king exposed on g6? Now it's time to dive into some exercises, and we're kicking things off aggressively with a sharp position from Mr. Garry Kasparov himself. As we mentioned earlier, this sacrifice can appear at all levels of play. For instance, in this position between Kasparov with the white pieces and Nigel Short with black, Short moved his bishop to b4, attacking the rook. But that turned out to be a serious mistake. Can you now find and calculate the winning continuation? Pause the video and white to play and win. Mr. Kasparov crushed Nigel Short by starting with the classic bishop sacrifice on h7. Black is forced to capture. Now comes the thematic knight g5, check. This is possible because the bishop was deflected from defending this square. If the king steps up to g6, Kasparov replies with rook g3, and a coordinated attack from all white's pieces will follow. So instead, Short decides to retreat to g8, but that will not save him either. Kasparov now continues with rook h3, threatening to follow up with the classic Damiano's mate idea. So, to avoid that, black replies with rook e8, hoping to give the king an escape route. White continues with queen f3, threatening the f7 square, which Short defends with queen to d7. Now the queen moves to h5. There's nothing left to do. The king tries to run with king f8. And now comes knight h7, a strong move. If the king returns, white continues with knight f6, a double attack. After the knight is captured, queen h8 is checkmate. So instead, the king tries to escape to e7, but Kasparov replies with bishop g5. There is nothing left to do but play f6, but now comes knight takes pawn. After the knight is captured, bishop takes on f6. King f8 is the only move. Then comes queen h8, king f7, and finally queen g7, checkmate. a brutal massacre delivered by Kasparov against Nigel Short. Now let's move on to exercise number 2, where white is to play and launch a devastating attack against the king. Pause the video and take a moment to analyze, not just your move, but also black's possible defenses. In this position, it does not work to start right away with bishop takes h7. After the king captures, there's a bishop on e7 guarding the g5 square, preventing the knight from jumping in. And without that knight, the attack simply does not work. So, the winning move is to first eliminate the knight on c5 with the bishop, which also removes the bishop's defense over the g5 square. And now, everything is ready for the thematic bishop sacrifice on h7. The king must capture, and then comes the powerful knight g5, check. If the black king steps up to g6, we already know the pattern. The attack continues with queen g4 or queen d3, check. It is hard to calculate everything to the end, but objectively, white is completely winning by attack. If instead of this continuation, the king retreats to g8, then comes the crushing queen h5. As we can see, there's no way for black to defend the h7 square. No knight and no piece alongside this diagonal can help. That means mate on h7 is coming, so the only way to escape is by playing rook e8. And now we follow up with the 5-move checkmate sequence we already learned earlier. It starts with queen takes f7, check. King h8 is forced. Then queen h5, check, followed by king g8. Next comes queen h7, check. King f8, queen h8, check. King e7, and finally, queen takes g7, checkmate. The exact same checkmate we studied in the theory section, but this time from a different position. Now let's move on to a third exercise. This next exercise is much more complex than the previous ones, as it involves many more subtle details. White to play and win. Pause the video and try to find the winning continuation. To win in this position, we begin with the typical sacrifice. Bishop takes h7. The king must capture, and now comes the familiar move, queen h5. This time, however, the black king has no choice but to go back to g8. But now, there is no knight g5, and that is one of the key difficulties in this position. White takes advantage of the fact that the black queen is undefended, and that the d5 pawn is pinned, by playing knight e4, a strong move. The queen is under attack, and no matter where it goes, once it moves, the knight will jump to g5 and the attack will once again become deadly. But here you have to be careful. Black can reply with queen c4, intending to answer knight g5 with queen d3. As we discussed earlier, we must be careful about the defense of this square along this diagonal, and everything would be lost for white if not for the spectacular move e4. Double exclamations for this one. This blocks the queen's defensive path, and now there is no way to stop the invasion on h7. Black could try moving the rook to d8 and bringing the king out toward the center, but the player handling the black pieces had no will left to keep fighting under such conditions and decided to resign. I hope that, through these examples, the key subtleties that make this sacrifice such a powerful attacking weapon are now much clearer. Now, let me invite you to move on to the next concept, where we will explore a sacrifice that is even more devastating than this one. In many games, players proceed with a development of the castling side rook, but in some cases, this can be dangerous as it weakens the critical f7 square. This often leads to a typical sacrifice, either with a knight or a bishop, and the king can then suffer along the a2 to g8 diagonal, or the equivalent if reversed. For example, in this position, black neglected this square, and white took advantage with the classic sacrifice, knight takes f7. Once the king recaptures, the queen enters, in this case on e6. The king is forced to move to f8, and now the knight is captured. The bishop recaptures, but the main problem for black with this typical sacrifice is that it weakens the diagonal, allowing the attack to continue, for example, with bishop to c4. The consequences are catastrophic. So let's remember, when the f7 square is weak, only defended by the king and vulnerable along this diagonal, we must constantly watch out for the possibility of a piece sacrifice on this square. Because it's one of the classic thematic sacrifices used to break castling and launch an attack against the king. So now, let's move on to the 3 exercises to explore this concept in greater depth. Let's begin with this first exercise, where Mikhail Tal has the white pieces. Pause the video and try to play like the magician from Riga. In this position, we clearly see the elements we discussed earlier. The f7 square is weak, only defended by the king, and there's a direct attack along the diagonal targeting that square. Mikhail Tal destroyed the opponent's position with the classic sacrifice, bishop takes f7. The idea is that after the king captures, as we mentioned earlier, the attack continues along the weakened diagonal with queen b3 check. If the king steps out of castling and tries to go to g6, there's mate in 4 moves, starting with knight h4. You can verify it yourself. And if instead the king retreats to f8, the attack continues against the weakened f7 square with knight g5. Black is completely lost and decided to resign. Let's continue with this next exercise, where it's black to move and win. Pause the video and try to find the winning sequence. In this position, we once again see the knight targeting f2, the bishop aiming along the diagonal, and the rook attacking down the e-file, very similar to the example from the introduction. That's why black can once again go for the typical sacrifice, knight takes f2. In this case, if white tries to eliminate the attacker on c5 with the rook, the capture on d1 comes first, leading to a material advantage. If the knight is captured with the queen, then black enters on e3 with a decisive pin. If, on the other hand, it's captured with the king, the powerful move rook takes e3 follows. This threatens the queen and sets up a deadly discovered attack when the rook moves, a very typical idea that appears in countless games, and one we definitely need to learn. Let's move on to exercise number 3, where it's white to move and win. Pause the video and try to calculate the winning sequence. In this position, we once again see a direct attack on the f7 square, which is only defended by the king, and the attack can also continue along this diagonal. So white is going to win by starting with bishop takes f7, double exclamations for this move. After the king captures, the precise winning sequence continues with rook takes rook, a strong move. If the knight recaptures, the reply is queen e6, checkmate, as the king has no safe square to escape to. That forces the black queen to capture on e8, but after that, the attack along the diagonal continues with queen c4, which gives check, while also uncovering the rook's attack on the enemy queen. After a move like bishop d5 to block the check, white captures the queen. And once the white queen is recaptured, the rook on b8 is left undefended. As a result of the entire sequence, the first player ends up winning a pawn and the exchange. Now, let's move on to the next concept, where we'll study another powerful attacking idea. In the Moscow tournament of 1925, Mexican player Carlos Torre, playing white, faced off against former world champion Emanuel Lasker, and they reached the following position. The black king is completely surrounded by pieces. On the other hand, the bishop on g5 is pinned by the black queen on b5. It cannot move because the undefended white queen is right behind it on h5, making it seem like white is about to lose a piece. But the Mexican player has an idea, and he is not about to miss the chance to execute it. He plays bishop f6, double exclamation marks. The queens are now facing each other, and black is forced to capture. The idea is that after this, white plays rook takes g7 with check, and the king has no choice but to go to h8. But now black falls into a forced sequence of discovered checks, where the rook becomes completely untouchable, free to move wherever it wants without any possible response. First, it captures on f7 with check. The king has no choice but to return to where it came from. The rook checks again, forcing the king back to the previous position. Then the rook captures the bishop on b7, again with check. The king returns to g8, the rook goes back to g7, and the black king is forced, once again, into the corner, right under the bishop's x-ray. This time, the check is delivered on g5, aiming to recover the queen. The king has only one legal square. White then recaptures the queen, collecting the loan plus interest, since they've also picked up a bishop and 2 pawns along the way. The king can still go to g6, delivering a double attack. But the rook moves back to h3, the bishop is captured, and then the rook takes on h6. Now the result is clear. White has won 3 pawns. This tactical pattern is known as the windmill, and it appears in countless games. To practice it, let's move on and solve the 3 corresponding exercises. In this first exercise, it's white to move and win. The idea is the same windmill pattern we just studied. It's a fun and forced 12-move sequence that might seem difficult at first, but I'm 100% sure that if we focus, we can calculate it all the way to the end. So pause the video and try to work out the entire winning sequence. Black is attacking the g2 square with 3 pieces, but white captures the rook with the queen. Double exclamations for this move. The idea is not just to eliminate one of the attackers, but also to remove the defender of g6. After the recapture, the rook enters on this square. Notice that the king cannot escape to the f file because of the rook on f1, so it is forced to go to h7. But now, the king is caught in the same discovered check pattern we saw in the first example, trapped inside the windmill. The rook is going to capture everything in its path without consequences. It starts by taking the e6 pawn with a discovered check. The king must move to one of 2 squares, let's say g7 for example. Then the rook gives check again from g6. It forces the king to go back, once again, to h7, stepping right into another discovered check. Now the rook captures on d6 with check. Let's suppose this time the king moves to g8, although it's no different from g7. The same move follows, rook g6, forcing the king back to h7. Then the rook continues by capturing on c6, and the same pattern repeats until it reaches a6. After the king moves, white captures the queen. The result? Both sides have a rook and a minor piece, but white has an extra rook, a completely winning advantage. In this second exercise, we have 2 former world champions, Vasily Smyslov playing white and Max Euwe with the black pieces. White to move and win. Pause the video and try to find the winning sequence, which, of course, is related to the theme we've been studying in this lesson, the windmill. White already has a rook on the 7th rank, and if we look closely, the bishop can enter along this diagonal, but the queen is still defending c6. So it must be deflected, starting with the strong move bishop takes e5. Black recaptures with the rook, but now comes the spectacular sacrifice, queen takes e5. As we mentioned earlier, the idea is to deflect the black queen from defending c6, because once it captures, the bishop enters decisively. The king has only one move, to b8. Now comes the thematic rook b7 check. The king must return to the corner, and from here, white can continue with the classic windmill, using the discovered checks to capture black's pieces with complete impunity. Or the rook can simply slide along the b-file to deliver checkmate. This next example is more complex than the previous ones. In this case, the king is not castled, but even so, the devastating attack we've been studying, the windmill, can still be carried out. White to move and win. Pause the video and try to find the winning continuation. Black is up the exchange, but the king is trapped in the center of the board, unable to castle or connect the rooks, which gives white multiple ways to win. One option is to check with the queen on c5. Another is to play bishop h6. Both are valid. But there's also a spectacular way to win, sacrificing the queen immediately on f6. Because once the queen is captured, the bishop enters on h6 with check. The king cannot move to e8 because the bishop controls that square, so the only move is to go to g8. After that comes rook g7 check, and the only response is to go back to f8. Now the black king is fully trapped in the powerful windmill sequence. Because once the rook captures on c7 with a discovered check, the king is again forced to return to g8. And the same procedure continues until the rook eventually captures the a7 pawn. Now we've reached a critical moment. Capturing the queen is possible, but then black would take the rook and the attack would come to a halt. Instead, white has a spectacular move, bishop f7, double exclamations for this one. It's the truly hard-to-spot move in this entire sequence. There's no alternative. Black is forced to capture. After that, the rook takes on a8 with check. The king cannot escape via f7 because the queen controls that square, and that was the whole point of sacrificing the bishop there in the first place. If the queen tries to block the check on f8, she is captured, and it's checkmate. So instead, black is forced to give up the queen on e8, after which it is taken. The king escapes to f7, but then the rook is captured on h8. The result of the entire sequence? White is left with the full rook up. With that, we've finished this chapter on thematic sacrifices against castling.